This is the 5-minute guide to the Sverige class coastal defense battleships of the Swedish Navy. First of all, I would like to say that trying to process Swedish words through an English text-to-speech device is an exercise in pain. Damn you Swedish language. Anyway. The coastal defense battleship was a product of the ironclad and dreadnought age up until the 1920s. The vast number of purpose-built ships of this class were made for countries that either could not afford or did not need full-scale ocean-going battleships, but might need to defend themselves from enemy battleships or cruisers. Generally, these ships possessed the same kind of main battery as contemporary capital ships as well as similar armor, but they were slower, of shallower draft, and generally had a smaller or non-existent secondary armament. Although they would be at a disadvantage in a fight against a regular battleship in the open ocean, in their chosen environment they were able to negotiate shallow water other ships of their armament could not, and therefore exploit the local terrain to maximum advantage. The Sverige class were one of the largest and best equipped examples, being designed and built at a time when dreadnoughts were coming into service. They did not fully reflect all the developments of the larger powers, but at just under 8,000 tons displacement there was no way you could reasonably expect this. The class consisted of 3 ships, the Sverige, the Drottning Victoria and the Gustav V. The previous class had been armed with only a pair of 8-inch guns, no real threat to the modern dreadnoughts of Britain and Germany, and so the new ships were a big step up. Although the main belt was somewhat thinner than dreadnoughts at about 8 inches thick, this still left them better protected than some battle cruisers. The armament consisted of 4 11-inch guns and a pair of twin turrets, one at each end, along with a secondary battery of 8 6-inch guns which were all in turrets, a technological advancement at the time for secondary batteries. These were arranged in 3 single turrets on either side and a twin turret super firing over the forward 11-inch twin turret. 4 75mm and a pair of 57mm anti-aircraft guns along with a couple of machine guns and a pair of torpedo tubes completed the armament. The Swedish government selected the design as the most powerful from a whole variety of options, but then an election brought in a new government which postponed the funding. The Swedish people then rallied behind the king and supplied the funding for the first ships themselves, which forced the government to step down, and third government to form, which ordered the ship in 1912, named for Sweden as a whole. 3 years later a pair of additional ships were ordered, named after the King and Queen of Sweden. These later ships were built to a slightly different design that allowed them to better operate as icebreakers. Since the ships came into service toward the end of the First World War they did not accomplish that much in this period, but the 1920s and 1930s they were modernized to use oil fuel for a speed of 23 knots, along with the removal of the torpedo tubes and a considerable portion of the ship's secondary battery in favor of numerous 8, 20, 25, and 40mm anti-aircraft guns. This period also allowed for the evolution of the tactics that would be used in the event of war. Essentially the ships would form a battle group sailing together along with smaller craft such as cruisers, destroyers, torpedo boats, mine layers, submarines and aircraft. Operating from the shallow coastal waters this force would be far stronger than any raiding cruiser or other lesser ship, and a battleship or battle cruiser would find itself limited in mobility in the shallow water, and therefore subject to swarming attack by the smaller Swedish vessels whilst also having to deal with 12 11-inch guns coming in from 3 separate sources. Although their slower speed would mean something like a Scharnhorst or an Alm could pick the fleet apart at range in the open ocean, Sweden wasn't planning on invading anyone else, so that scenario did not matter. This was all put to the test when the Second World War broke out. Germany swiftly invaded Norway and Denmark, whilst Finland was semi-allied due to a mutual dislike of Russia. That left Sweden as the last Scandinavian state still vaguely free, but sitting on a lot of natural resources Hitler really wanted. However, Sweden was never invaded, and after the war declassified German plans seemed to indicate one of the major reasons was that an army in Sweden would have to be supplied by sea, and the German Navy was not confident that it had the forces at hand to maintain sea superiority over the Swedish Navy. Whilst a lot of German ships were tied up trying to hurt the British and other allied navies, this consideration appears to indicate the deterrent effect of the Sverige class was highly effective. The Sverige herself, along with the Drottning Victoria, remained in service until the late 1950s, whilst although the Gustav V was taken out of service at the same time, it was not scrapped until the 1970s. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or a suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below.